Hello and welcome to my presentation of the Core Data Framework. I will be explaining the framework and giving you a brief overview of its capabilities. And I will be doing so through the use of the Swift UI expense tracking app, which is an open source app available on GitHub. The link is in the description below. So here's what you see when you first open the app. We have two tabs, a dashboard and a logs tab. When we navigate to the Logs tab, we see that we're able to add expenses that we have. So let's go ahead and add some expenses. So we can say our first expense is travel, $100, category entertainment, and we have our date set, and we can save our expense. We can also add an additional expense, say groceries, $40, food, and save that as well. Here in our expense log, we can see that the expenses that we just created have been added to the list, and we can sort by the expense in ascending or descending order, as well as by date and category as well. And when we move to the dashboard tab, we see that our total expenses are neatly displayed using this pie chart. But interestingly, what happens when we close our app and reopen it? Well, here we see that our expenses that we previously added remain in the app. And how this is actually achieved is through the Core Data Framework. So what the Core Data Framework actually is a framework that allows you to store objects in memory and on disk. And it's a very simple and easy to use framework if you're not looking for external storage on a database. And it's an iOS framework that provides a lot of capabilities through the use of abstraction. So let's describe what the Core Data Framework does using this image which I found online, which I think describes it pretty well. Let's start with the NS persistent store. The NS persistent store is a persistent container that that defines how our objects are stored. Our objects are stored usually in three different ways in the Core Data Framework, either in memory or as binary, or by using an SQLite database. It's important to note that in the Core Data Framework, we never actually directly interface with the persistent store. Instead, what we use is a NS persistent store coordinator, which is used for fetching as well as saving objects to the persistent store. And what are these objects exactly? Well, these objects are NS managed object models, which are your typical data models that describe an entity with its properties and attributes. When we fetch and receive objects from the NS persistent store coordinator, these objects typically live within something known as an NS managed object context. And this context essentially defines how objects are changed, edited, updated, or deleted. And once these changes have been made within a particular context, these changes can all be saved at once by saving that particular context. And therefore, it makes it very easy to make any changes to the objects we want without having to save after every single change we make. And this is the power of the managed object context. In terms of actually receiving objects, we do that through an NS fetch request, which is a request made by us when we want to use objects in our app. And we specify the context within which these objects that we receive exist in. So we clearly have an overview right now of how the Core Data Framework conceptually works. Let's see how this framework has been implemented within the context of the expense tracking app. So when we move to the expense tracking app, we first see that we have this expense tracker core data file that's been set up which is a file that's set up when we create a new iOS project with core data being built in. Inside this core data file, we see that we've defined an entity known as expense log. This entity has certain attributes. In this case, it has an amount, category, date, ID, and name, along with its corresponding types. In addition to the attributes, we can also specify any relationships that the entity has, as well as fetch properties. In terms of the actual setting up of the core data stack, that's done through the core data stack file we see here. And here we see many of the concepts that were explained through the previous image. We see that we're setting up a NS persistent container with a particular name, as well as deriving a view context for that container. So now that we've set up our core data stack, let's see how this is actually used in terms of functionality. For that, we will navigate to our log form view. Our log form view is the form that popped up on our second tab that allowed us to add an expense to our app with a particular name and category. So when we want to add an expense to our app and have it saved to disk, we see that this Swift UI view has access to the context that we previously created, an NS match object context. And once the save button on the top right is actually hit, we can see that the following happens. We see that the onSave tapped function is called. And once this function is called, we see that an expense log entity object is created with the context being the NS managed object context that we've created in our core data stack. This allows us to create a new object within that particular context and follow that up by setting up the attributes of the entity, the ID, the name, the category, and the amount, as well as the date. And then once we've set up the object, we can try saving the context, which essentially pushes all changes that we made to a particular context to disk. And this ensures that our expense that we've just created is now stored in memory on the phone. So now that we've actually stored objects in our app, how do we get them back using core data? For that, we can look at the log list view example. The log list view is essentially this list you see over here, which details our different expenses in a row-by-row format. So in this Swift UI view, we again see that we have access to our NS managed object context. But below that, we see that we have a fetch request. A fetch request, as we explained previously, fetches objects from our persistent container within a particular context. In this case, we see that the object that we're trying to fetch is our expense log entities, and we want to sort the objects by their date. Once we actually fetch these objects, we store them as an array of objects within this variable called result over here. And these objects are then displayed on our app by iterating through the array and displaying each object and its attributes on the screen. Again, we see here that we have capabilities for deleting an object by calling context.delete and then saving the context. This example clearly shows how it's easy to get objects from a persistent container as well as manipulate them and then save to a particular context. Overall, the core data framework is clearly a very powerful framework that allows us to achieve a lot through some very simple lines of code with a lot of logic being handled by the framework behind the scenes. It's a great choice if you don't want to use an external database and instead want to use purely local storage. It allows you to set up a persistent container, interface with it, as well as easily make changes to your objects and push those changes by saving the context within which those objects reside. So overall, it's a great choice to use, and I hope that this overview of the framework gives you an idea of its capabilities and hopefully it pushes you to implement it and explore it more in the future. Thank you very much.